my name is Carrie. Welcome to practice. We'll get started today in our intro to yin class in just a comfortable seated position. So whatever that means for you, if it's cross-legged, you might want to sit up on a pillow or a folded blanket, especially if your knees are a lot higher than your hips. That way you can let your knees drop down towards the floor. Also, I recommend if you find your pelvis rolling back, just bring your hands by your hips, press into your hands, lift your sit bones up and kind of move them back on your pillow or your blanket to help you create that nice neutral position of your pelvis. Sit up tall, rest your hands however they feel comfortable, so whether it's palms face down or face up, and close your eyes. Start to take some long, deep, full breaths to settle into your space, settle into your body. And so the yin practice, we will hold our poses for anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes. And the reason for that is we are working with the connective tissue rather than muscle. So muscles take a lot less time to create a stretch because they have more water content. Whereas our connective tissues, things like our fascia, ligaments, tendons, those are denser tissues and also have less water content. So it takes a longer, more steady hold in order to create some mobility, some length, some stretch in those areas. And one of the ways that fascia has been described to me, which I thought was a really good description, it really visually gave me an idea of what fascia is when you're peeling an orange, when you peel off the outside skin, you know that there's this white layer that's then over the flesh of the orange. And then as you continue to kind of peel away the orange, open up the quarters of the orange or pieces of the orange, you find that white kind of runs all the way through the orange. You see it throughout. And that's what fascia is like in our body. It connects everything. And so, ages ago, when they used to study the body, they would kind of cut the fascia away and just look at the muscles and the organs and those things. But over time, they've discovered that fascia is a really important piece to look at because it is connecting everything in the body. It's around all of our organs, it's around all of our muscles, and then it's also around like groups of organs and groups of muscles. And so when we are chronically under stress, or we're dehydrated, or we're not moving our body, that fascia over time can get like tight, and also as it gets dehydrated, it just loses that flexibility, that mobility. So in our yin practice, we hold these poses and we work with that fascia so that we can maintain our mobility over time. So for myself as an athlete who's over 40, it's important to me to have yin as part of my regular practice to maintain my mobility and also help my joints. So there's more of that connective tissue around all of our joints. So when we work with our yin practice, we're focusing on those joints. Our practice today in particular, I'm focusing on poses that are all related to how to relieve low back pain, because many of us, a lot of people experience low back pain. So what we'll be working with today are all of the things that are connected to creating some of that discomfort in our low back, because majority of low back pain is not caused by structural issues in the spine. It's more caused by all this other stuff that's connected and then putting tension on the spine. So we'll work with our hamstrings and the fascia around the hamstrings and the backs of our legs, which can cause stress on the spine. We'll work on the outer hips. We'll work on the hip flexors. So all of those things that are connected. We'll take another few breaths here, and then I'll move us into our next pose and then continue to explain why we're doing the various poses that we're doing. So I'll be quiet for a few breaths here to just let you reconnect to your breath. Settle your body. still have your eyes closed, go ahead and open your eyes. Stretch your legs forward. And just find some movement in your legs. We've had the knees bent there for a while, so you might find a little gentle bounce in your legs. Our next pose is actually, we'll be seated for as well. So you can kind of stay where you are. And if you were using something underneath your hips to help you keep that neutral position of your spine and your pelvis, you can stay up on that support. This is dragonfly pose. So for this pose, you'll bring your feet out wide. I'm actually just gonna back up a little bit here for the video purposes. Bring your feet out nice and wide. Recheck in with your hips. Make sure you're in that nice neutral position of your pelvis. And for this pose, we'll simply walk forward between your legs. And as you can see, I'm not super flexible here, so I don't come forward very far. There are people who have a lot more flexibility who might be able to almost make themselves flat on the floor. And so we have several different things going on in this pose. The reason we're doing it today is associated with relieving low back pain, is to stretch the whole back line here of the legs, which can contribute to that tension on the spine. The other things that you might feel going on here is a stretch in the inner legs and a stretch in your low back. So it is a forward fold, even if you're not folding very far forward. So you are still getting a bit of that stretch for your low back. A couple different things here. If you have an extra pillow, if you're sitting on one, or if you have something to put underneath your forearms, you could do that just to help you rest your upper body a little bit more. And then also soften your shoulders and relax your head. So we want all of our muscles to relax as much as possible so that we can access the connective tissue. So when the muscles are engaged, that doesn't let us get to those overlying and underlying connective tissues around the muscles. So we want the muscles to relax as much as possible. A couple things that could happen here in this pose in terms of things you might need to support is you might have some discomfort behind your knees. If that's the case, you could bend your knees a little bit or bring your legs in a little closer so it's just less tension there on the backs of the knees. Other thing that could happen as we hold in this pose is maybe the back of your neck gets uncomfortable. If that happens, you can lift up your head, move your head a little bit gently side to side, and then release your head back down. And so this pose will hold for a total of 4 minutes. So we are halfway through so far. And you might notice as you hold in these poses that maybe your body starts to, on its own, release a little bit. You might find you're able to fold a little more forward. But we want to avoid pulling ourselves into any of these shapes. You want your body to just naturally be able to relax into the pose rather than any kind of jarring of the body. We want to just let yourself settle in. And there's not a particular breath that we use in the in-practice, but I do always encourage lengthening your exhales. That helps your body return to the parasympathetic nervous system. So out of fight or flight, back to our natural state, our relaxation state, our rest and digest part of our nervous system. You might also feel we're folded forward, so maybe your breath feels a little restricted. So focus on your breath, trying to increase those inhales and exhales to calm your body and your mind. Allow yourself to let go. In all of our poses today, I want you to feel stretch, and sometimes you might feel a little discomfort. It might feel like a little dull achiness in certain areas, but I never want you to feel any sharp pain. Sharp pain is bad, so if you do feel any sharp pain, that might mean that you have to adjust something or support yourself in some way with a blanket or a pillow Also, today we're not doing any, but there's many poses in yin that I'll use blocks to just help support the body. We've made it through our 4 minutes here in this pose, so slowly start to walk your hands up to help lift your torso. And then our legs have been out straight here for a while, so you want to, one leg at a time, use your hand behind your knee to bend your knee, bring your leg to center, and do the same on the other side. And then before we move on to our next long hold, we want to take a reset. So you'll come down onto your back on your mat, and I'll give you 2 different options. One is pentacle pose, with your arms and your legs out straight and wide, and tuck your shoulder blades underneath you. Shift your hips down so that you just bring your spine back to a neutral position after we were in that folded forward position. If this causes any discomfort in your low back, the alternative is constructive rest. Feet come wide to the edges of your mat with your knees bent. Let your knees fall to each other and just rest your arms wherever they feel comfortable. So these reset poses just help us return to a neutral position, let everything relax in between those longer holds. And we have a couple different reset poses. This is just one that I find is really great after a forward fold because it's a nice reset for the spine. Couple more breaths here in the reset. And then bend your knees, hug your knees into your chest. You can take a little rock side to side, massage your low back. And depending on your surface and depending on your back, you can either rock the length of your spine a few times to come all the way up, or just roll to one side or the other to make your way up. Then we'll come through a tabletop position to set up for swan pose, and this will be a 2-part pose. We'll move through swan into sleeping swan. So from your tabletop, bring your right knee outside of your right wrist, bring your foot over towards the left side of your mat, and bring your left leg straight back. Now some of you might recognize this pose as being similar to pigeon pose, which we do in our vinyasa practice. It has a different name in yin. It's called swan pose because our purpose here is a little bit different. The goal here in this part of the pose is to stretch a bit of the hip flexors of the left leg, the leg that's back. So you want to make sure that left toes are pointing straight back. You can use your hands or maybe your fists down on your mat to help bring your torso up and your heart forward so that you might be feeling that stretch in the hip flexors. And you can look forward in front of your mat. My cat's gonna steal my blanket. If you find that your right hip is really far away from the mat, you could tuck your folded blanket or a pillow underneath to provide you some support there so that your hips stay pretty level in this pose. We'll stay in this more lifted position for another about 4 or 5 breaths. And it's a fairly gentle stretch here for the hip flexors. One of the hip flexor muscles, one of the major muscles, is the psoas, which connects to L1 through 5, so the lumbar spine, all the way to the femur. And so we want to create a stretch there because, as you can imagine, it's pulling on the low spine, so it can be a contributor to low back pain. And take another couple breaths here in this upright position. This is a bit more active because you are using the strength of your arms to keep yourself lifted, but we want the legs, the hips to be as relaxed as possible. We'll take this into sleeping swan by walking your torso forward and bringing your elbows out wide, bringing your forehead down either onto your hands, or if you need to be a little more lifted here because the outer hip is really tight, you could stack one fist on top of the other and bring your forehead down onto your fist. So in this part of the pose, we are more focused on the outer hip. So you're probably not feeling as much of a stretch anymore in the hip flexor, probably feeling this primarily in the outer right hip. Keep that pillow there if you needed it to help you keep your hips level, if you had a lot of space there between your butt and the floor. And if you do have any pain at all in your knee in this pose, come out and take deer pose instead. That puts less pressure on your knee. And that's to bring the right shin parallel to the top of your mat. Left knee bends so that your knee is just behind your heel. I like to move the flesh of that right thigh out of the way and then walk either over your knee or over your shin and let yourself relax. That just takes some of the weight that kind of gets put on the knee here if this is too much compression in Sleeping Swan. If you're okay in Sleeping Swan, you can stay there. And I just want to tell you one other variation that you could take in this pose is to bring your right knee more towards the center of your mat with your heel in closer to your body. And same thing, you're still folded over your leg. And if you take that variation, you might find that more than being in the outer hip, you might feel this stretch a little bit more in your glutes. There's a deep muscle in the glutes called the piriformis that attaches the sacrum to the femur. It allows us to externally rotate our leg, and the sciatic nerve passes by that area. So when the psoas and the fascia that's around it is tight, it can cause that whole space to get a little bit jammed up and can cause some sciatica. So that also could be something that this pose can help relieve if you can kind of more target that glute muscle rather than the outer hip. So we'll settle in here for another about 4 or 5 more breaths. I'll be quiet and let you just settle into your pose. And to come out of this pose, walk your hands back underneath your shoulders so you lift your torso up. Curl your left toes under to kind of bump that left knee in a little bit, and then bring your right knee back. Come to seated, bring your legs out in front of you, and before we switch to the other side, we'll just windshield wiper the legs a little bit side to side. So lean back on your hands, bend your knees, plant your feet so they're wide to the edges of your mat. Let your knees fall side to side. And you probably will notice that that outer right hip feels more open now than the left. So we're going to even that out by now coming to the left side. We'll come back through center, come back to your tabletop position. And to set up for swan pose on the left side, bring your left knee outside that left wrist. Stretch your right leg straight back, point your toes, and we'll start in this lifted position. So make sure I'm timing us here. You can use your hands, you could use your fists. Our goal here is to stretch the right hip flexors, so working with the psoas and the other hip flexors, not only the muscle, but also all of the fascia that is around that set of muscles. If you find that that left hip is pretty far from the floor, which mine is, you could bring your pillow just underneath there to give you a little bit more support so that you're not kind of leaning into the pose. You're able to keep the hips pretty level. Look forward. And notice where you feel this the most. Sometimes, depending on where you have tightness in your body, you might feel it in a different area than what I'm talking about. That doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. One of the things that is one of my favorite things about the yin practice is it's completely different in everybody's body. And you can do things to support yourself in the poses using props to make it work for you, no matter what you have going on. So you might feel this in a different area, and that's okay. We'll take some more breaths here in our more upright position to work with those hip flexors. Another few breaths in the upright position. And we'll take this into sleeping swan. Walk yourself forward. Bring your elbows out wide so that you can relax your shoulders. Bring your head down into something. So whether it's your hands, you could even stack one fist on the other if you need a little more height. It could be a pillow, it could be a folded blanket, it could be all the way down to your mat, whatever works for you to give you that stretch in the outer left hip. Now if you found, or if you do find in general that your glutes tend to be really tight, you could take the knee a little more to center to help you target a little bit more of that piriformis and the fascia that's around that muscle. If this is too much compression on your knee and hurts your knees, come into deer pose instead. Left shin parallel to the top of your mat, right knee just behind your heel, sit up tall, and then walk forward either over your shin or over your knee if you need a little less intensity. If you're okay in your sleeping swan, we'll stay there for that outer hip stretch. And the other thing to take note of here is whether you're clenching your jaw or your face. So I mentioned everything in our body is connected by fascia, and so there's these 5 myofascial sheaths that run through the body, one of which is the lateral myofascial sheath, so you could think of that as kind of your whole side seam. And so there is a connection between the outer hip and the outer jaw. So sometimes when we're stretching the outer hip, you might find your jaw clenching. If that's happening, open and close your mouth a couple times, and then let your jaw relax. I'll take a few more breaths here on this side. Nice, long, full inhales and exhales. Walk your hands back underneath your shoulders. Sit onto that left hip, bring that right knee forward. We'll come all the way to seated with your legs out in front of you. Feet planted wide. Lean back on either your hands or your forearms. We'll windshield wiper the legs again. Just to allow us to feel now that the left and the right hip hopefully feel more even. We usually do have one side that's tighter than the other. For me, it's my right side. It's my stronger side, so it's the side I tend to rely on more. So you might notice that in any of these poses that we do one side and then the other. Bring your legs back to center. We'll set up for our next pose, which is sometimes referred to as supine half moon. Sometimes it's referred to as banana asana because we'll make like a banana shape with our body. So you bring your heels over to the left edge of your mat, and you could either have your feet just sitting next to each other, or you can hook your right ankle on top of the left ankle. And here comes the tricky part. We need to lower our upper body down so that we create that banana shape in the body by lowering our upper body down to the left, and reach your arms either all the way up overhead, or if you're tight in the shoulders like I am, you can bring your arms into either like a cactus shape or a loose diamond shape. If that's still too much on your shoulders and it's really hard to keep both shoulders down, you can bring your arms either out to the side or down by your sides. But our goal, couple goals in this pose, are to stretch this whole outside seam of the body, that whole lateral myofascial sheath, and then also the quadratus lumborum, the QL, and the fascia that's around that area and that muscle. Because when that is tight, because it connects to the ribs, it can cause an achy low back. And a few things to note here. You want to be sure that your hips both are flat on the mat. You're not like lifting one. So if you have to kind of back out a little bit, that's okay. And also that your shoulders are completely down. So if you need to change the arm position, change it however you need to. You might find that as we hold, you find more space and you can bring yourself a little deeper into the shape, a little more of a curve in your banana. And the other thing I like to focus on here in this pose is to imagine that you can breathe more into your right lung so that you can expand all along the right ribs. And so there's fascia and intercostal muscles are along the ribs. And so we want to create that nice stretch for that area as well. So you might feel a big stretch here in two directions, one from your hip all the way up to your armpit or even all the way up to your hand. And then also maybe from your hip down to your feet. Probably more so in the upper body is my guess. It's probably what you're feeling more. The torso. Mine is really directed a lot around the hip. I'm feeling it mostly in this area. We're halfway through this side. Allow your head, your shoulders to be heavy. And sometimes the most challenging part of our yin practice is your mind, settling your mind, because oftentimes our mind maybe gets a little bored because it's used to always being active and thinking about things. So you could always give your mind something to do by counting your breath. Count 1 on the inhale, 2 on the exhale, and keep counting like that until you reach 10 and start over again. And if you lose your place, just start over again at 1. That helps give your mind something to keep it occupied so that your body will stay in the pose, even if your mind is saying, I'm tired of being here. Sometimes that's the hardest part, is just staying for these long holds. That was one of the biggest struggles I had when I first started the yin practice. I've always had a very active mind. So staying still for those long periods was challenging. It's also what made me very aware that I needed this practice more than any other. Just checking our time here. We have 1 more minute. Once you come out of this pose, unhook the ankles if you had those hooked. Bend your knees and just roll all the way onto your left side into a fetal position. You can use your left arm as a pillow. Let's rest here for a few breaths. This will be our reset coming out of this pose. And use your free hand to press yourself up. And set up for the other side from seated. So bring your heels over towards that right side of your mat. An option to hook that left ankle on top of the right. Keep your hips down on the mat. Lower your upper body down so that your upper body is as much to the right as you can be while still keeping your shoulders and your hips both down on the mat. You could either reach your arms up overhead, or if the shoulders feel really tight, cactus or maybe a loose diamond. Or if that's still too much and it's really hard to keep those shoulders down, you can bring your arms out in whatever position works for you, whether it's out wide or down by your sides. We want to make sure we keep that nice foundation in the hips and the shoulders to support you in this big stretch for that left side of the body. And as I mentioned before, you might notice differences from side to side. So maybe this side, you feel it in a different area. I'm hoping you're feeling a stretch down that whole left side, primarily up from the hip all the way to your armpit or even up through your hand. And as much as you can, think about focusing your breath more into your left lung. So you can create that expansion in the ribs, stretch the fascia and the intercostal muscles that are along the rib cage. And keep your head heavy. As we hold, you might find you've created some more space. Maybe you can come a little deeper into your curve, your banana shape. And in our world today, we don't get very many opportunities to be still. So allow this practice to be an opportunity to find some stillness. Have an opportunity to relax your mind, relax your body. So this can be really great for reducing stress, to calm your mind and body. Chronic stress is one of those major enemies of our fascia. Can cause inflammation, limit our mobility when everything is inflamed. We're just over halfway through this side. We're doing this pose for our low back and for our side body, but you might also be feeling a nice stretch in your shoulders. depending on your lung capacity. We have about 5 or 6 more breaths on this side. Once you come out of this side, unhook your ankles first, bend your knees. Roll all the way to your right side, use your right arm as a pillow. Take a few breaths here in our reset. And roll all the way back onto your back. Bring your hips to center, so you might grab the long edges of your mat. Make sure you're nice and centered on your mat. Shoulder blades underneath you. Bring your, let's roll all the way to the left side with the left arm out straight this time instead of underneath your head. Take your right arm, open your right arm all the way to the right. So you might find to get that right shoulder all the way down, your right knee might lift away from the left. If that happens and it feels like the outer part of your right leg is holding on, bring a pillow or a folded blanket in between your thighs or your knees just to allow that top leg to relax. This is a supine twist, which is probably another pose that's familiar to you, but we'll be holding this for 5 minutes today instead of our short, 1 minute that we might hold a supine twist in our vinyasa practice. You can either look straight up at the ceiling or over towards the right. Your arms can be out straight, or you could cactus them if that feels better, if that helps you keep your shoulders more rooted down on your mat. So this pose, the reason we're doing it today for this idea of relieving low back pain is to provide a twist for our spine. So it twists all of the muscles and fascia that run along the spine to help release them. And it's good to move our spine in all of the directions that it moves. Our spine moves in 6 directions, twists being 2 of those 6, twists to each side. And then we've got the lateral movement, which we just did in Banana Asana. So those 2 are, another 2 of the 6 with that lateral move to the left and right. And then we've got forward fold and back bend. So flexion and extension. Which we did dragonfly pose, which is a forward fold, and we'll also end up doing a back bend here as well after our twist. So that's the other thing we're doing in our practice today, is moving our spine in all 6 directions that it moves to help maintain that mobility. As we age and as we move through our lives and do kind of our normal patterns of movement, sometimes we're not moving in all of the directions that we can move, particularly with the spine. And so we lose that ability to move because the body is pretty smart, and it's like, well, you're not moving in this way, so we don't need to maintain length there. We can tighten and shorten. And so when things start to tighten and shorten, we lose our flexibility and mobility. So with the in practice, by moving in all directions that we might not move in our normal life, we're maintaining mobility. We're more than halfway, just to give you a reference point here of where we're at. So if you were using something between your knees, you might try removing that, see if you've maybe created some more space. If it still feels like that top leg is holding on, you can bring your support back. Also, another thing to note here is if you are getting any discomfort in your low back, you could try shifting your hips more to the right. If that doesn't relieve it, the other option with the pillow is to bring it underneath the bottom knee so that it backs you out of the twist slightly, so it's maybe not as much of a twist if you are getting any discomfort in your low back. Stretch is good, but no sharp pain. Few more breaths. So come out of this like you're closing a book, bring that right arm all the way back over to meet your left. Come onto your left side into that fetal position. You can use your left arm as a pillow and take a few breaths here as a reset. Roll back onto your back. Recenter your hips. Roll onto your right side. So as you roll, you might shift your hips a little bit to the left. Bring that right arm straight out from your shoulder rather than underneath your head. And then unfold that left arm to bring your left shoulder all the way down. If that causes your knee to lift away from the right, you can bring your pillow in between your knees or your thighs. Tuck the shoulder blades underneath you. Make sure you're nice and rooted here in the shoulders. If you are getting any of that discomfort in your low back, shift your hips more to the left, or maybe bring a pillow or a folded blanket underneath the bottom knee to take you slightly out of the twist. You can either gaze straight up or to include your cervical spine. In the twist, you can gaze to the left. You might find that one side, maybe you feel more resistance than the other side. Just notice. Or in practice is a great opportunity to start to notice where you have some imbalances in your body. We all have them, so it's not with any judgment, of course, if you do have imbalances, but it's just an opportunity to start to notice. And then you might start to notice in your daily movements of what might be causing some of those imbalances. We're not completely symmetrical side to side. You might once again just focus on your breath, maybe close your eyes. Let yourself settle into the shape. just reached the halfway point. If you find that you've maybe created some more space, you might try taking the pillow away if you had a pillow there providing support. Could always bring it back if you still need it. I was talking about twists in reference to how good they are for the spine, but they're also good for our digestive system. We're giving a nice good squeeze to a lot of the digestive organs. I personally love anatomy and love learning about anatomy, so I like to kind of geek out on that stuff. One more minute. About 3 more breaths. Nice big long full breaths. And to come out, you'll just bring that left arm all the way over to meet your right. Roll all the way onto your right side. You can remove any props. Rest your head on your right arm. Take a few breaths. And roll back onto your back. Grab the long edges of your mat. Recenter your hips. We'll take just a moment here in constructive rest. Since we were in that twist, we want to bring the spine back to neutral, so bring your feet out wide, knees fall to each other. A few breaths here. Just notice how your back's feeling. Hug your knees into your chest, take a little rock side to side. And then depending on your surface and on your spine, you can either rock the length of your spine a few times or roll to your side and press yourself up. Our next pose is supine hero's pose, Supta, also sometimes in yin referred to as saddle pose. So you'll come to your mat with your knees bent and knees together, feet apart, and sit in between your feet. Now this pose can be really intense on the knees, especially if you have any knee injuries. I personally have had a lot of issues with my knees over time. So if you find that your sit bones don't come all the way down to your mat, you could bring your feet together, sit on your heels, and just rest your hands on your thighs. Stay here in Seiza pose. This is a perfectly great place to be. If that bothers your knees, bring your folded blanket. You'll have to kind of come forward to get your blanket so that it's right behind your knee crease. and then sit back. And you might have to fold your blanket multiple times and keep making that higher in order to relieve pressure in the knees if you have pressure in the knees. If you do not have pressure in your knees and your sit bones are all the way down onto your mat in this saddle pose, you could walk back onto your hands. You might start feeling a stretch here in the fronts of your thighs. You could walk down onto your forearms, or maybe all the way to your back. And I can never quite get all the way to my back unless I'm really open. But you could bring a pillow between your shoulder blades. Oops, mine's too low. And I have to fold my pillow because I can't, because I need a little more height. In between your shoulder blades and underneath your head. So that's if you can get back pretty far, but not all the way to your mat. Another area here that you might feel discomfort is in the ankles. If that's the case, you could use your folded blanket to come underneath the ankles so that it just takes some of that pressure off. So wherever you have ended up, whether you're in Seiza pose and you might have your blanket folded several times, giving you some space, or if you're in saddle pose. With saddle pose, if you're back, you're also getting that back bend that I talked about. But the reason we're doing this pose, even if you're not all the way back, is you're probably feeling a nice stretch in the front of the thighs, which is our goal, because the quadriceps, particularly the most superficial, the most close to the surface, the rectus femoris, is and all the fascia around it, connect and can pull on your pelvis, which then causes a tilt in your pelvis, which causes lordosis, which is more of a curve in your lumbar spine. And that can cause your hamstrings to be pulled tight and taut, which can be problematic over time. And it can also cause that low back pain. The other issue with that tight rectus femoris is it might be holding on to your kneecap, your patella, not allowing your kneecap to track properly. That's a problem that I've had a lot over my lifetime, is that proper movement of the patella. So this pose is great for that reason as well, in addition to helping relieve some of that low back pain. Now, depending on how long it took you to get settled here, you might not have been in this pose as long as some of the others, but we're going to hold this for another little less than a minute. And you might have to adjust, maybe if you're back on your pillow or back all the way down on your back and it's just starting to get to be too intense, you can always start to back out a little bit. Or vice versa, if you're finding that you're creating more space, maybe you're able to come back further. And your gaze can either be like straight ahead, down the bridge of your nose, or you can open your throat slightly, but think about still lengthening your neck. So you don't want to drop your head all the way back. You want to keep some length in your neck. 2 more breaths. If there's anybody who is all the way back, you'll want to press into your forearms, hands, elbows, come all the way up. We'll all come to stretch the legs out in front of you. You can move any props that you might have been using. Stretch your legs forward. And I gotta admit, that's one of the poses that has always been really challenging for me, and one of the things that, there's always gonna be some poses you have some aversion to. Those are usually the ones we need to do more. Can kind of point and flex your feet, shake out your legs, just get that fresh blood flow back in your feet. And I meant to mention too, if you ever are in a pose and you get that tingly sensation, like a foot or a hand or any limb has fallen asleep, you'll always want to come out of your pose, get that fresh blood flow back, and then return. Okay, so now we'll just come into Shavasana, lower all the way to your back. I meant to give us a little bit longer here in our Shavasana, but we have about 3 minutes. You can let your body settle into your space. Tuck shoulder blades underneath you, shift your hips down. Bring your arms out wide. If there's any other, little adjustments that you need to make, go ahead and make your adjustments, then let your whole body relax. And I promise I will be quiet for at least the next minute to give you this opportunity to be still and notice your breath and notice any lingering sensations in your body. Bring your awareness to your low back. Notice how it's feeling. You might feel a little sensitive right after class. Just as you move through the rest of your day, notice if maybe your low back feels a little better, if you've been experiencing any tension there. And start to wiggle your fingers and your toes. Roll your ankles and your wrists. And take a big full body stretch. Reach your arms up overhead, your legs out straight. Let your back arch up off the mat like you're just waking up. Big, nice big stretch. And bend your knees. Roll over onto either side. And take a couple breaths in a fetal position. And press into your hand. Make your way back up to seated. And sit comfortably back to where we started. Nice, easy cross-legged position. Sit up tall. Close your eyes. Your hands together at your heart. I always like to close my classes with a final breath together. Exhale. Big inhale through your nose. And exhale, let it go. And thank you so much for joining me. I wish you a beautiful rest of your day. Stay warm. Namaste.